Hi everyone, my name is Amanda Archibald and I'm the founder and owner of the Genomic Kitchen. What I do for a living is I look at DNA on a daily basis and provide insights into how your genes are influencing your health and how you can optimize your health based on insights that we're gleaning from your genes. I work with individuals around the world, but I also work side by side with clinicians in this space, also teaching clinicians the power of DNA, empowering them to use genetics, nutrigenomics in practice around the world. But what I want to do with this particular video today is talk about what I see when I look at genes and their influence on bone health. Bone health is very, very personal for me because I do live with osteopenia and osteoporosis, and I'm actively working with insights from my genes and with really great clinicians and exercise physiologists to reverse my osteoporosis and osteopenia. And guess what? When you start with the right information, you can turn things around. So what I'm going to do then is share with you some insights from genes into what may be influencing your bone health. And I'm going to move from the classic vitamin D and calcium into other areas that are lesser known, which we're definitely seeing in the scientific literature, but may not be hearing about from your doctor or your clinical team. So let's take a look and go on a completely, hopefully, revelatory journey for you into what do we know from genes that can influence how you approach your bone health. Let's get started. Here we go. So bone health and the genes I look at to understand health risk and health opportunity for you and for anyone I may be working with. So a lot of things impact bone health. Genetics is certainly one area, but it's not predictive. I don't look at genes and say, well, you're going to get osteoporosis or osteopenia. What we do when we look at genes is create an impression of where we might want to look, bolster something, do a lab test just to see where you are. So they're not being used to diagnose something. And in my line of work, because I'm not a medical doctor, I can't diagnose, but I can look at patterns that shape an impression that will give you a, if you will, a prescription on what you can do next. Medications, different kinds of medications can certainly support bone health or rebuilding bone, but many of them take away from your bone. Stress and emotional stress has a huge effect on your bone health and maybe something you haven't thought about. Anything that is toxic in our environment is toxic to you and your bones are going to feel it. Inflammation and oxidative stress are at the root of pretty much all disease, and it's definitely something we pay attention to, whether we're looking at your bones, your heart, your brain, or anything that has to do with your health. We all know that too much drinking and smoking is going to be deleterious to your health, so that's a known. And what you eat is especially important to your health. But for your bones, it goes beyond get your calcium and check your vitamin D. Are they both important? Yes, but I got more insights for you. And then also hormones. Well, what is the connection between hormones and your bones? We're going to look into that. So one of the things I want you to understand is what's written right here on this slide is that your bones or bone itself is a dynamic organ. It's constantly in motion. So it undergoes something called constant remodeling, so turning over. And it, as you can see here, bone is a dynamic organ that undergoes constant remodeling, an energetically costly process by which old bone is replaced and localized bone defects or chinks and kinks in your bones are repaired to renew the skeleton over time, thereby maintaining skeletal health. In other words, it's in constant motion. I like to think of your bones as being a huge warehouse, like a server or a file server, if you will, that your body will store things in, but take away from. And the challenge is, how do you create the balance? You want your bone to recycle so it's in optimal health, if you will. It's working optimally for you, but you don't want to store junk in there. And you don't want to live your life in such a way in that your bone becomes a constantly depleted warehouse. And that is what is happening to many of us, unbeknown to us, living in this very demanding 21st century world. And yes, it can be that some of you are eating everything correctly, doing your best, drinking your milk if that's where you get your calcium from, or eating your greens, making sure you're going out in the sunshine. And yet, maybe you too got a diagnosis of osteopenia and osteoporosis. And you said, how can that happen to me? Well, genes provide a very interesting insights into what may be happening. And I can't tell you how often I am sitting with a midlife or middle age, if you will, male or female, and I'm looking at their genes saying, you know what, do me a favor. When you next see your doctor or make an appointment with your doctor and ask for a bone mineral density scan, because I want to make sure, based on the gene pattern I'm seeing, that we are optimizing your health to make sure that you aren't someone who's going to be told to take medications to shore up your bones as you get older. Okay, so as you heard from me, with our bones, it's a constant, it's a organ in motion. And what we want to do is strike a balance, okay? Because your bones are constantly seeking to balance between bone formation and what we call bone resorption. So breaking down, building up. It's constantly in motion. And any changes to this balance result in a change in bone density or bone mass. So when you change bone mass in a negative direction and you lose bone, that's when you end up with a diagnosis like osteoporosis or osteopenia or osteoarthritis. They're common names that we're using to say, there's a negative change in your bone mass. You're losing more bone than you're making. Bones are constantly in motion. So genes, as you've heard from me, can help me help you, but genes help us in science and medicine think about your bones far more than get your calcium and get your vitamin D. Are they important? You've heard me say that, yes, but there's so much more to the story. So let's take a look at that story, okay? And I'm going to turn my video off here so we can just focus on the slides and I'll come back in at the end. So genes direct us to look differently at bone health. And what I'm going to take you through here is a look into how hormones impact your health and whether genes are involved there, how inflammation can impact not only your health but bone health, and what genes can be impacting bone health when I look at a gene blueprint. How is that happening? What does stress do? What's this process of methylation? As you can see here, I say methylation is always present, mostly overlooked, particularly in bone health. And then there are genes that I call them structural genes, genes that are instrumental to bone building. So here we're going to look very quickly at vitamin D, which you know about, and then some proteins that can actually chip away, if you will, at the structure, not only of your bones, but your cartilage and collagen, which are instrumental to keeping you upright, keeping you glued together, if you will. And then quick nod to caffeine. And you know what? I'm going to jump off on caffeine here before I go to the next slide. But before I do that, I'm going to zip right to the top, because here's the thing. I'm not going to talk about the gut in this particular presentation. But what I will say to you, as so many of you will know, is if your gut's out of order, all health bets are off. Okay, so I can give you all the information that you want and need and you want to hear about as it pertains to what to eat and what to do with your life to create balance with your bones. But if you can't absorb the nutrients that your bones and your body needs, you can forget about it. Okay, without the gut, forget the bones. So first stop is, before you even kind of dive any further, take a step back and say, gosh, how's my gut working? Have I got one day on and 2 days off? It feels great sometimes. A lot of times it doesn't. Get it fixed. See a licensed health professional. See a nutrition expert. See someone who can help you get your gut in balance. Then you can come back and listen to the rest of this. Okay, and I wanted a quick nod to caffeine here. So this gene here, CYP1A2, is a gene we look at to tell us how well you metabolize coffee or caffeine. So caffeine, of course, you find in coffee, chocolate, a lot of your fortified bars and beverages in the sports arena, and also in tea, okay, particularly green and black tea. It depends on the tea, so check that out to see if you're drinking caffeinated tea or not, if that's of interest to you. So what we see from this gene is you're either a fast metabolizer, medium metabolizer, or slow metabolizer. When we look at CYP1A2 with respect to bones, we want to make sure, actually, regardless of the gene, that too much caffeine can actually deplete your bones. Too much caffeine is toxic. If you are a slow metabolizer, you probably know it already. You get the jitters, you can't sleep if you drink more than 1 cup of coffee, and please don't drink a cup of coffee late at night. Too much caffeine is toxic. Anything that is toxic, whether it's environmental, whether it's caffeine, is going to deplete your bones. What I mean by that is going to upset the balance I'm going to show you between building bones and depleting bones. Remember caffeine. If you don't know whether you're a fast or slow metabolizer, then genetics can help you understand that, but oftentimes you know. All right? So caffeine, quick nod there. All right, caffeine and gut. Let's talk about hormones. So what you're seeing here on the left is a panel that I have grabbed from a genetic test. It's a sample genetic test. Don't worry, I'm not showing somebody's genes here. In fact, throughout this presentation, you're not going to see anybody's gene blueprint, okay? But what we're looking at in this particular panel are genes that can impact hormone balance. And what has hormone balance got to do with bones? Well, a couple of the key genes that we may look at, and there are many, are the SHBG gene, the sex hormone binding globulin. It's actually a protein, right? But the gene encodes for protein. And then this one, CYP19A1. So let's look at these. So SHBG, sex hormone binding globulin, binds and transports sex hormones that you may know as testosterone, dihydrotestosterone, and estrogen. And what we're seeing from scientific literature is when we have an aberration or a variant in this gene that reduces its prowess, if you will, its capability, its capacity to do its job, which is binding and transporting these sex hormones, there's a correlation between it and osteoporosis. So several studies, as you can see here, note there's an inverse relationship or inverse correlation between serum levels of this binding protein and bone mineral density in both males and females. So what that means is if your doctor runs a lab test or a test for SHBG and it's low, then there's a potential that you're getting a lower impact of this protein. In other words, transportation, binding and transportation and availability of these sex hormones may be lower. And if you look over here in my little sample panel, you can see that there's lots of color here. All I want you to see is when you have like a maroon here or a purple, it means in this case that these genes are less efficient. Now I'm looking, you can see this is a panel looking at hormone balance, and under S you can see SHBG is there. So in my mind, I look at that and I think, let me put that in the little basket of information I'm storing as I'm looking at your genes, looking at your health history and answering your question and saying, is this someone I may say, based on this and a number of genes, yeah, I should opt for a bone mineral density test. Okay, so why is this gene important? Because it transports and makes available to your cells and tissues, if you will, key hormones, sex hormones. Okay, and what we know is testosterone, as well as estradiol or estrogen, think of it as estrogen, appear to stimulate bone turnover or bone remodeling. In other words, they're really, really important in bone health. So you want them to be available. You'll see a little later as I keep chatting that estrogen is particularly important. Okay, so SHBG, take a look at that. CYP19A1, we also know this as the aromatase enzyme. And what it helps do is convert androstenediones, we haven't mentioned that, so an androgen to estrogen, and testosterone to estradiol. In other words, it helps take testosterone, which is a precursor to estrogen, and converts it into an active form of estrogen. Why is this important? Because estrogen stimulates osteoblasts, which are basically your bone cells. So there is a connection between sex hormones, their availability. That's why we're interested in SHBG, but we're also interested in the availability of estrogen for both males and female, men and women, because estrogen is one of the primers or principal products, if you will, one of many, that helps you build bone. Okay, it kind of prods the process. So there's a connection between age, sex hormones, and bone health, which is why many of you may be reading and hearing about why is it there's a relationship between midlife, male and females, okay, it's not just females, and depletion or less availability of estrogen and testosterone, and the incidence of osteopenia and osteoporosis. There is a connection. So any genes that impact the availability of these hormones, whether it's binding, transportation, or conversion, are at play. They're important. So I can look at a gene blueprint and I can pick out genes here. I'm looking at this as pretty high impact, but here's our CYP19A1. The yellow means it's probably 90% functional, okay? But what we're looking at in genes are patterns. Like you could have a lot of functional genes, you know, in one basket, but then when you when you kind of, what's the word, deal the genes out on the table and say, well, let me look at the genes that may be associated with bone health, you may see a number of genes that are kind of quite high impact. All right, so genes that are related to hormones play a role in bone health. They shape my thinking as I'm looking at patterns to tell your story. And so the main thing I want to show you here is a point that I just made. So estrogen is really, really important to bone balance. Okay, so if we can just draw a line here from estrogen, they stimulate osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are really important to the maintenance of activating, if you will, activating bone modeling and remodeling and maintaining bone so you maintain a nice balance. Okay, and so the quote here from this paper is estrogen deficiency, or you could say lack of availability or declining levels, is associated with the gap between bone resorption bone formation. So it alters that balance. You can see more resorption or bone loss than bone formation. And this is likely due to the loss of the effects of estrogen on essentially creating a balance. That's what you really want to take away here. And so estrogen helps stimulate osteocytes, um, and so the kind of core or starter cell, if you will, for bone building and bone remodeling. But what it also does, and I've kind of put this in yellow here, is it helps to modulate. Let's read this and I'll explain it. The expression of this molecule, rankle, which activates another molecule called NF-kappa B. NF-kappa B is a potent molecule that's associated with bone breakdown. So while estrogen, when it's present, it can help with activating it. It kind of shoots the trigger at getting bone cells to mature, sort of start that process, mature, and develop into the bone matrix. Okay, so it's a positive. But when estrogen is present, it's also turning off a key factor or key trigger that activates this molecule, NF-kappa B, which is a potently associated with inflammation and also bone breakdown. So it's important to see that, bone is a dynamic organ, okay? It constantly vacillates between building and breaking down. All right, so we need both. If the bone is injured, if you got a nick, deficiency, injury to the bone, you need to get the trash out, get the junk out, right? So it's important that we repair the bone, we remodel the bone, but we always want to be constantly building and rebuilding and never taking away. You want a balance, not a negative. All right, so estrogen, super, super important. What about inflammation? Again, you're looking here at a panel from a genetic test. You see a whole bunch of numbers and genes here. Some of you who've maybe looked at a genetic test say, oh yeah, I sort of understand that. I know those are genes. Many of you looking and said, what on earth am I reading here? And basically the way I read this, it's almost like reading code. I understand, and so do clinicians who are trained in this space, what these genes do and what they mean. And what the colors are showing here is the level of impact, where maroon, in this case, is saying high impact, probably not working in your favor. Doesn't mean to say you can't do anything about it. It just means they're not necessarily working in your favor. So what can we do about that? How do we read this? So inflammation, it doesn't matter, as I said earlier, whether it's your brain or your heart or your bones or your blood vessels. Inflammation is inflammation, and it is the root cause of imbalance in your body. Imbalance can lead to disease. So when we're looking at inflammation, are there certain genes in the inflammation bucket that could be more detrimental, if you will, to your bone health? And how do we know? Well, we know this through the scientific literature. We know this through research and studies, peer-reviewed research, which genes maybe at play and which are not. So when we're looking at inflammation, what we're looking at, or what we know, is that high levels of IL-6 and other inflammatory molecules, we call them cytokines, such as IL-1 or IL-1B and TNF-alpha, can impact the healthy differentiation of what we call mesenchymal stem cells. These are the starter cells for bone that you find in the bone marrow. It can impact or kind of slow down the healthy maturation of these starter cells into your osteoblasts. In other words, they're a negative, they're pushing back. And these same cytokines, these same molecules that I just mentioned, can suppress osteoblast function. What does that mean? It says not only is it slowing down the maturation, the process of them maturing into osteoblasts, but can they actually kind of turn down their function? It can make them less functional. So they can alter this balance between osteoblasts, those are your your maturing bone cells, if you will, an osteoclast, which are the initiating cells which break down bone. And IL-6 is particularly nauseating in this case because it particularly will stimulate the development of osteoclasts, which lead or initiate the process of bone resorption. So osteoclasts, negative. Osteoblasts, positive. You need a balance, yes, okay, because we do need to break down sick bone, right? We do need to get rid of injured components, which is why some of these inflammatory molecules are important, right? Their inflammation can be healthy to a certain point because it helps the body fix itself, but when it gets out of hand, not so great. And IL-6 is what we call a gain of function gene. It means it's locked, loaded, ready to go. It's like, just give me the right information, I'm out the door. Kind of like, your dog who can't wait to get out of the door when you get home. It's like, bam, out the door. Just open the door. So what can we do with IL-6? Like, gosh, I've got it here. Look, this IL-1, IL-6. That's not so great. What can we do? We can introduce certain foods that contain bioactives. So bioactives are molecules that actually can initiate uh, gene expression, if you will. They can activate them. Or in some cases, they can activate processes that will turn down the volume or the availability of a gene to do its job. So think of it like a block. So quercetin, if you know my work, you've heard me talk about quercetin before. Quercetin can potently kind of down-regulate, turn the volume down on IL-6. We think of quercetin in specific foods like all your alliums, onions, chives, leeks, capers, potent, radishes and their leaves, even fennel, and elderberry as well. Ursolic acid, the most potent food sources of ursolic acid happen to be rosemary and sage. So eat your herbs. The fresher, the better, right? They're potent sources of this bioactive. Also, apple peels as well. Luteolin. Luteolin, one of the best sources is this potent nutrient, or it's actually a bioactive. It's not really a nutrient. It's like a signaling molecule. You may know it is a phytochemical or a phytonutrient. The most potent sources in the world is Mexican oregano. So not your Italian oregano, but Mexican. Now, oregano, you're going to find, it doesn't matter where you get it in the world, it's going to have be a source of luteolin, but the Mexican source is the best. Thyme, celery seeds, and juniper berries, if any of you are familiar with them. And rutin, best source of rutin is buckwheat. So they all contain bioactives that can help turn down the impact of IL-6. If you don't have a genetic test, what are you going to do? How do you know if IL-6 is at play for you? It doesn't matter. Build these foods in anyway because we all have the IL-6 gene. It's just a genetic test. We're saying, if I'm going to prioritize foods that I want you to target, probably we're going to talk about introducing some of the foods that contain these bioactives because it's going to kind of gag this gene a little bit, okay? Put a gag on it, muffle it a little bit. But the other thing here, as we talked about already, is estrogen itself. This very, very important sex hormone that humans have can also modulate IL-6 and other inflammatory molecules. So inflammatory molecules, we often call them cytokines. They're also known as cytokines. And there are other molecules too, but IL-6, IL-1, IL-1B, IL-1 beta, and TNF alpha are considered inflammatory molecules. So the presence of estrogen once again acts as a balance. So I'm going to stop this presentation right here, give you some time to think through this, and I'm going to welcome you back in the next session so we can look further into what are some of the other things that genes suggest we take a look at because they are impacting your bone health. So I'll see you back in the next session.